Ian has more than 30 years of experience in the resource industries, working for the last 17 years to advance the management of socially responsible mining and sustainable development. He's worked for governments and major and junior mining companies, commercial and international financial institutions, non-governmental organizations and communities. Ian is a frequent speaker at industry conferences worldwide, publishing in both peer-reviewed and industry journals. Ian has led development of standards and guidelines for the management of social issues during mineral exploration and mine development. He authored the first version of the Community Engagement for the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada E3+ online manual of good practice, and facilitated construction of the principles and guidance for responsible exploration for PDAC. Please welcome Ian Thompson.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. This is a very intimidating audience here. There's a lot of brain power around the room. I was asked if I could talk and perhaps stimulate a discussion. So I've put together some ideas with the objective of being somewhat controversial. And some of you may have heard some of this before. I make no apologies for that because the controversy, I think, continues. And hopefully that will end up in some sort of a discussion. And I've framed this around the notion of a social contract, or the need for a social contract. And the question would be, mining social contract. So I better give you a definition, because I'm not sure everybody's going to follow social contract. You might be thinking about Hobbes and Locke and guys from the 1700s. Rousseau would be the other big thinker that contributed to this. But really, it's the way I'd like to talk about it is as an explicit or tacit, in this case tacit, agreement for mutual benefit between an individual group and the government or community as a whole. And I'm going to talk about group as being the mining industry, and community as a whole would be society at large. And where are we and where do we stand? I think if we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, certainly when I first became aware of the industry and involved with the industry, the social contract was already starting to be challenged, but it essentially said that mining provides jobs at the mine and resources for the world. And in return, it pays royalties and taxes to government, and shareholders and owners make a profit. That was the deal. That was a tacit agreement that you can go out there and mine, providing you provide jobs, the resources go to the world, you pay your taxes. So I think people might be reasonably happy that this is where things were, but then it changed. This is a diagram that Susan Joyce and I put together for a presentation that Susan gave at the CIM in 1999. And it shows the trajectory of two seriously important pressures on the industry. The big long one here was the environmental trajectory, the environmental movement and its influence on the industry, which began here with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Almost immediately there was the development of a certain level of legislation. We had the EIA Act in the United States, and then it kind of spread to other parts of the world. There was a significant amount of resistance on the part of the industry, and when I became, in the 1980s, it was kind of like blood on the streets. The industry was really pushing back. Began in the 70s. The argument was, this will drive us out of business. It's not, we need unlimited access to land. We need to be able to do what we need to do in order to make money, in order to provide the resources to the world at a price appropriate for the world. So there was a lot of resistance, but towards the end of the 80s there was acceptance. I recognized something of a generational shift at that time. The class of 40, whatever it was, or 51 or 53, depending on how you define it, moved out of the C-suite and a new group moved in, and they kind of said, environment? Sure. Why not? Let's do it. And it became internalized as part of management, and these days you won't find anybody who doesn't say that the mining industry wants to be responsible, can be responsible, and in many respects is responsible. So that was added to the social contract. The expectation and the agreement that the industry would take responsibility for environmental impacts, management, and things like that. A rather different trajectory came off the ground in the early 90s. It came around about the Rio summit, but there were other influences going on in there. There's the breakdown of the Berlin Wall. There's all sorts of other social factors involved. But nevertheless, there was this social trajectory, a new set of pressures that the industry struggled to deal with, continues in some respects to struggle to deal with, but they surged. They came up on a very different slope. They really did surge through. There was a certain amount of resistance. There's a measure of acceptance right now. And back there in 1999, Susan postulated that there would be legislation, right, that would move this into some sort of domain. The legislation came early in the environmental trajectory. She figured that something would happen around about sometime in the early part of the last decade. Well, that's not what happened. Rather than legislation, a plethora of initiatives, voluntary initiatives, were either introduced to the industry or the industry adopted itself. I mean, one of the really big ones here is the Global Mining Initiative on the Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development Initiative that went alongside of it, that brought the whole idea of sustainable development right inside the mining sector. But there were various other ones, beginning around 2000, the OECD guidelines, the Global Compact, the Voluntary Principles, the Global Reporting Initiative. ICMM was formed in 2002. PDAC came out with E3 Plus in 2003. The banks got involved with the Equator Principles. By 2005, the Mining Association of Canada had got towards sustainable mining. All of these voluntary initiatives. Very important, but I stress voluntary initiatives. Now, they all came in the early part of what's now called the supercycle. And looking back on the supercycle, ICMM came out with this data set, which suggests an almost exponential increase in the number of conflicts over the life of the supercycle. There's been, just 2 weeks ago, a very interesting study came out of the University of Ottawa by Hallam and a name I can't remember, looking at conflict and essentially validating that as being a reasonable representation of what happened, and that yes, indeed, over the life of the supercycle, the number of conflicts increased. Now, other people say it's not so simple, and I'd agree with them. It's not so simple because the level of activity increased somewhat exponentially over the same period of time. Now, this is data from Metals Economics Group. If you plot the level of activity as per Metals Economics Group against the number of conflicts as per ICMM, you get a graph like this, which suggests that there's more or less a frequency factor here, right? As the level of activity goes up, so do the number of conflicts, which would sort of suggest that there's an inevitable number of conflicts per $1 billion of expenditure. But it's a rather ragged relationship. Although it's surprisingly linear, it is a rather ragged relationship. So when you plot that as a frequency over time, in other words, put conflicts over dollars and then plot them against years, you get this, which shows a little bit of a spike at the beginning, and then a trend downwards, followed by a rapid rise, and then a leveling off at the end of that time period, with a hinge point, 2008. Of course, 2008 was the financial crisis. So was the financial crisis an influencing factor here? 2008, 2009 is also when resource nationalism surged. Was that a fact? I honestly don't know. We don't have enough data to put on that. But what we do have some information about is the way in which the language of the industry has shifted over time. So let's have a look at that. Now, back in the 1990s, when all of this was taking off, the conversation was all about community relations. What's going on in that interface between the project and the community, the mine and the community? I wrote a paper in 1997 on that topic, on mineral exploration and the challenge of community relations. That was the language of the day. But come 2001, 2002, and the Global Mining Initiative, the language shifted to sustainable development. That was very much the language. That was what it was all framed about. The Global Mining Initiative was an initiative to be able to go to the the Johannesburg Summit, and present a platform describing the way in which the mining sector would make its contribution to sustainable development. So it was all about sustainable development, but bit by bit, the language shifted. By the time we get to 2004, 2005, lots of people are talking about the contribution to sustainable development. Right? Then it became social and environmental sustainability. Right? It's trickling a little bit narrow. And then in 2010, lo and behold, we start to see companies talk about the sustainability of the corporation, because they've shifted a lot of their language to corporate social responsibility, which seems to have been something like sustainability light. And corporate social responsibility started off as being a pretty broad portfolio. When I wrote the final version of PDAC's Principles and Guidance for Responsible Mineral Exploration, it had 8 functions in there. 8 functions in there. So it was all about responsibility in a broad package that included ethical conduct, health and safety, community engagement, due diligence, responsible due diligence, project due diligence, and things like that. But over time, that became narrower as well. And again, around about 2008, 2009, it seemed to narrow down to be talking about what you're doing in terms of social investment and community development and capacity building and contributions to poverty reduction and things like that. And just last year, suddenly it was all about shared value, right? Which is actually a very, very narrow discussion about how you're going to share values. In fact, it's not about shared value. It's all about how industry's values are going to be the dominant value, and the decision will be around that. It was a discussion developed by the Harvard Business School, so not surprisingly, it's all about how business and development are driven by or are governed by the almighty dollar, which causes a bit of a problem if you loop back to community relations, because communities have their own set of values and they're not necessarily the same as the corporate ones. But if the decision is going to be made around corporate values, so be it. Okay. Nevertheless, we're seeing this trend of a narrowing down, and here we are right now in the middle of a really horrendously deep downturn for the industry. It's tough. It really is. I mean, there are cutbacks, layoffs. The junior sector has been decimated. They're out of the picture. People are looking inwards. It's all about survival. We've had a couple of very interesting stories came through. I belong to an informal group called the Social Practitioners Group. And we meet informally every now and again. The last meeting was in Groningen. I wasn't there, unfortunately. But it was reported back to me that there were 2 anecdotes that were shared, and they're kind of interesting. One was, and I don't know exactly where this comes from, and it was of a mine manager moving 2 people out of community relations, or whatever he called it, into his environmental group because he could defend an environmental person more successfully against cutbacks demanded by head office than he could a social person. Right? And a wonderful anecdote that came from situation on the ground that where a company was trying to cut back, reduce the social investment program that had been agreed with the community, and the community leader was saying, no, you should have thought about that when you negotiated this. So there are tensions out there are difficulties out there. Quite interesting the way things are going. Now we know a lot about what it takes to deal with these social issues. And it's not about how big your social investment program is. It's really about how you do it. A study by Kieran Moffat and Haran Zhang was a study done. They looked at a number of, they looked at 2 mines. They looked at the communities associated with them. They interviewed them twice over an 18-month period to find out what it was that dominated in the quality of the relationship with them. And they did this because they'd actually challenged this model, which is the Thomson and Boutillier model of social license. Because there's nothing in here about environment, and there's not very much in here about infrastructure and things like that. And this is the result. This is what they found. They found that the quality of the contact and the perceptions of fairness in the way in which the company dealt with people were the 2 dominant determinants. That the quantity of contacts had no influence, and this social investment side was actually very slightly negative, neutral to negative. So it's all about how you do it. It's not what you do. It's not how much money you put out there. It's how much you do it. And what do I learn from that? Well, I learned from that the conversation between the villager and the company there. Clearly, the contact quality wasn't there because they were going to be on the edge of an argument in no time. This work that's come out of the stuff that I've been working on with Bob Boutier and Leora Black says that it's building social capital in that quality of that relationship, which is absolutely important. Because if you don't build that, it doesn't matter what you do over here. It really doesn't. This thing we're calling social contract is all of that bundle of goodies, managing impacts, providing social investments, providing projects, and all the rest of it. But unless you are actually managing a relationship, it's not going to work. This is the sort of setup that does seem to work. This is modified by work by Luke and incorporates things here. So if a company has got good policy, direction, coordination, and accountability, and it articulates that through its vision, the sort of language it uses, and has a culture, things are going to work, providing it strikes that balance between social contract and social capital. This is the relationship side. This is the activity side. Managing real and perceived impacts and providing some sort of benefit. And the crazy thing about benefit, as we've learned from a lot of the social license studies, and we've got data from 47 surveys around the world now, is that benefit doesn't have to be money, and it doesn't have to be material. We had a study, an example, from Argentina, with a junior company that was working in an area of Mapuche, indigenous people. And they agreed with the Mapuche, we will deal with you as if all of the benefits available to you under ILO 169, that international agreement that Argentina has signed on, which is a agreement on the rights of indigenous people, indigenous and tribals people, as if the Argentinian government had actually implemented all of that. Argentinian government hasn't implemented all of that, but the company said, we will deal with you as if they were all in place. And that wow. I mean, the Mapuche responded to that as if they had received a real benefit. To them was a benefit. That hadn't actually cost the company anything other than the willingness to engage with that tribal group on that basis. Now, clearly you're going to need some competencies, methods of insurance, and some feedback and learning. And this looks like some huge organization. but it doesn't have to be. We've seen small companies with not much more than 2 people execute on this. And we've seen large companies struggle to do this. It's all to do with corporate cultures, it's all to do with leadership, it's all to do with the way things are thought through. So, if this social trajectory, as I would argue, is unfinished up here, it hasn't rolled over, where is it? And what does it mean in terms of mining's social contract? There are still concerns out there in the general public about aspects of environmental management as these unfortunate tailings failures, we keep having too many tailings failures as an industry, keep showing up. But a certain amount of concern is around the management of these social issues. We've got Mining Watch and others pushing away at Tahoe resources in Guatemala. We have a very sad series of situations in Peru around mining operations down there, and in others around the world. Things still, they're not level, and these social pressures aren't diminishing. Okay. Now, I think this is cause for a certain amount of thinking. What's going to happen next? Something that worries me a lot, I think should worry more people, is this. There are junior companies hanging on to properties in various parts of the world that because of a lack of funding, they haven't visited and may not have had any contact with for anything from 1 to 3 years. Now, when that money comes back, how are things going to work out? Will they be welcomed back? It's not easy to go back after a gap. It's not easy to go back if you've let people down. Whether people feel let down or not around these various projects I'm talking about is a moot point. What is fairly clear to me is that expectations have not decreased, and the number of social issues, pressures, has not decreased. And so what worries me a great deal is that as we saw at the beginning of the 1990 cycle in 92, 93, and as we saw at the beginning of the super cycle in 2001, 2, and 3, there will be a spike in conflicts, social conflicts, which will not be a happy situation. So we need to think about what's going on, because these pressures, these are the ongoing pressures, right? Population keeps growing, we're in a crowded world. The age of communications is on us, big time. In fact, with social media, it's even becoming even more intense. The risk society that emerged at the beginning of around about the beginning of the super cycle is very much with us and will continue. This skepticism of experts and politicians has not diminished in any way. So there continues to be a search for credibility, who to believe and who to trust, and stakeholders are as able and as willing to organize and mobilize and make life difficult for things around things they don't like as they ever were. And to that we should add the way in which human rights, particularly in light of Mr. Ruggies' recommendations and the adoption of what I would call Ruggies' rules of protect, respect, and remedy. I don't think that was fully digested before we got to the end of the super cycle, so there are still people out there who need to understand that better. Resource nationalism is still a factor in a lot of places, at least the thought process around it. And the big question about local share and what happens at the local level is alive. And there are these issues around the business model. Will the business model that supported the junior mining sector so successfully until around about 2011, is it going to be the same the next time around? Doesn't look like it at the moment. So what is going to be the financing model that's going to generate the product, really, the research and development end of the mining industry that develops the new product, the new mines, the new opportunities? That's on the one side. On the other side, we've got some very interesting things being flagged. After this most recent tailings failure down there in Brazil, the word seems to be going around that we need to change the business model. Right? That we need to think about things the same way that the oil and gas industry does, and have each of these as standalone, independent projects, divorced from the parent company and at arm's length as possible. So the response to this, initial response seems to be risk management, financial risk management, not change the model and tailings management. Hopefully that will come along as well. But okay, so is the business model going to be the same? And what is going to be society's response to a shift in the business model? We don't know. And the future looks pretty challenging. Right? There's going to be continued global population growth, and there are going to be structural adjustments. Our population is aging in North America. It's even more severe in Europe. Major population growths our real growths are in the developing world. And we've been talking about that for a long time. But alongside of that, looks like there may well be market shifts. One of the things that's been quite interesting to me at any rate is to see the way in which companies, mining companies in parts of Latin America, which were small players 15 years ago, are now becoming international players. That's a challenge to Canada and its role. China has become a huge broker in all of this and a major player. So there's structural shift, there's market shifts. Okay, where are the markets going to be? Probably more in where there is going to be development. And who are going to be the bigger players? Maybe not the same players as we have now. That's going to have some sort of effect. So there's technology change that goes along with that, along with these new markets and a new mix of metals. Are we going to continue to have the same portfolio of metals, or will some other metals start to become bigger players? Then we've got global climate change, and we're already seeing competition for water. Water's a huge issue for the mining sector. And alongside of that, likely competition for land and water. It's playing out in some very interesting ways. Some of you have probably seen these reports from northeastern Colombia, from La Guajira, of the drought in La Guajira. That's also the site of one of the largest coal mines, probably the largest coal mine in the world. And the competition for land and water, or the controversy around land and water associated with the Cerrejón coal mine and its relationship with the Wayuu people, is delicate. It's fragile. Then finally, we got this potential for a change in the center of gravity of mining, potentially to China, which seems determined to play a very major role. All of that aside, possible elements of a social contract seem to be the requirement to add to jobs at the mine, resources for the world, royalties for the government, and profits for the corporation, some elements of fairness, equity, and social justice, which would probably have to be worked out at the local level as to whether it's equal or proportional. Those are important. But certainly no privileged elites and no free riders would be what needs to happen at the local level. This direct interaction with people and relationship building would be important, but it seems that collaboration somehow or another is very, very important for the genuine alignment of interests and meeting of real expectations on both sides. It's not about sharing my values, no, it's sharing our values. So it's shared vision, rational objectives, and responsibility, which seems to suggest that to get past this sort of image that mining's there to create a problem, we probably do, in fact, need some level of regulation in order to make this really happen, because the voluntary approach has slid all over the place. Right? That's not to say it's failed. I'm not going to suggest that it's failed, but it hasn't delivered as completely and as successfully as we might want to hope. So my question would be, do you share any of these ideas? No? And if there were to be regulation, where should it start? What would it look like? I've got some very strong ideas of my own, but that's not really wise of me to push them too hard on you. I think that this is something that needs to be talked about much more broadly, because the industry doesn't like the idea of more regulations. It won't like that. But maybe it needs some level of regulation to kind of save it from itself, to create a level playing field, to create the environment where the perception of the industry is that it is accountable. Because that seems to be part of what is needed in order to move over that hump and establish a social contract at the very high level and at a global scale. We're in a much better position as an industry than this industry was at the end of the 1990s, when it was in a very, very bad position. But it has, in my opinion, it hasn't yet reached that level where a social contract can be described in its totality. That's my story. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you. Well, just to get the question part of this session going, you've kind of led into the question I was going to ask, which was, were the voluntary initiatives and guidelines an attempt by the mining industry to avoid legislation or avoid regulation? I think what we're seeing now is there is a little bit of legislation coming out, like the reporting legislation that is just coming into force now over the last couple of years for the oil and gas and mining industries, for government and community agreements and that sort of thing. But what would the purpose of the regulations that you're thinking of be?
Well, has the voluntary approach worked? I think it's actually been pretty successful, but it hasn't consolidated in the way that I think was hoped for at the very beginning. And I think the stories that I gave you of how it's sort of bent and twisted and narrowed down are an indication that it hasn't totally worked. So what sort of legislation would I personally?
Well, isn't it an attempt to sort of flatten out the curve, the social curve, so it doesn't just keep on going up? I don't know.
Well, I personally think that there needs to be, or it would be helpful if there were processes in place or requirements there that pushed the discussions, that pushed the relationship building side of things, because that's clearly the more important side. The companies, I did a study for the Canadian government back in 2010 looking at patterns of corporate social responsibility, and they were overwhelmingly philanthropic. Right? Mm-hmm. They were companies deciding, we can support this or we will do that, right? And that's not to say that they weren't relevant, but these were based on a priori assumptions within the company by and large, and not necessarily the product of an intimate discussion and collaborative decision making with communities. And where companies did that, boy, were they in a different place. Jan Boon's PhD thesis, which has just come out from the University of Ottawa, says essentially the same thing. And he looked at 8 projects in various places as kind of little capsule case histories. Also, this larger study I made reference to also came out of University of Ottawa. They were looking at conflict, and it was fairly clear from their meta-analysis, and they looked at around 700 conflicts. From their meta-analysis, that one of the key drivers for conflict related to the distributive characteristics experienced by the communities. So if they felt that this was fair or it wasn't right, that the distribution was skewed, we can point to all sorts of examples where, companies make an agreement about something, but it ends up that most of the benefit only flows to this part of the community. I was at a mine last year where they had, for many years, provided a grant to the local community for education. But in a discussion with the principal of the local school, not surprisingly, that over a 12-year period, only 3 families had benefited from this. Mm. Now, it turned out that the company gave the money to the community leadership. Community leadership basically gave it to their inside group. So the recommendation was, or the agreement, revised agreement was, give the money to the school and have the school committee, led by the principal, make the decision. This last year, for the first time, the grant went to people outside of this little privileged group, and reportedly, I haven't been back, but reportedly, the community is much happier because it seemed to be fair, right? And what was previously something that everybody sort of said, oh, well, okay, they're privileged, but we don't like it, but we'll tolerate it, right? Yeah. Had moved from a tolerance level to a, wow, okay, that's for all of us. If my kid's good enough, they'll get it too. So things like that, how can it's very difficult to think of exactly what that legislation might be. But certainly, you've pointed out the requirements for reporting on community agreements. Yeah. But there's no requirement to have a community agreement. No. So one of the things that's certainly being proposed in other parts of the world is the need to have a community agreement and guidelines on how to go about doing it. Because certainly the experience overall, unfortunately not universal, is that the process of negotiating that agreement is actually a key part of the relationship building, yeah, which creates better outcomes for everybody. So maybe that's one idea. We've had some interesting social license type studies involving big box stores, a casino a casino proposal in Sydney, Australia, and a highway expansion project. And it's the same dynamic. And it's not about the money, it's all about the relationship and people wanting to know what's going on, what's in it for me, and what are the consequences of all of this. And once you get that communication working effectively, it doesn't cost very much money. It's not about what you give people. It's where they feel that they fit into the whole process. I mean, one of the big problems I think that's been going on is that there's been this push back. What is the business case for all of this? Well, that's the excuse in a lot of cases for not doing it. Under the circumstances that we're living at the moment, we've seen a lot of cutbacks. We've seen some huge cutbacks in some major corporations. They've emasculated their capacity to do anything useful in this. Right? Yeah. And it seems that they've viewed this, rather than creating assets, as being simply a cost of business related to risk management. And they presumably feel that that risk is either small enough or manageable enough that they'll deal with it when it happens, rather than build the capacity to remove any likelihood of real conflict from the future, which would be an investment and creating an asset.
Is that what you were talking about when you said changing the business model after the Brazil tailings spill?
No. At the moment, they have a distributed model where you have a central office and then you have wholly owned subsidiaries, right? Well, the oil and gas industry has a much more dispersed relationship. Yeah. And its operations are usually at arm's length from the parent company. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that limits liability. Right. Okay?
Are there other examples that you like of the companies with the self-regulation that have set some precedent out there in the world of doing self-regulation, models that you like?
Yeah, there are quite a few. We've seen relationships built up in exploration being handed over successfully to operating companies. And we've seen operating companies look inwardly and work really hard to respond to constructive criticism and build a much better organization out of that. So yeah, and all of that's voluntary. None of that is prescribed.
The Johannesburg Stock Exchange adopted what they call the King 3 principles, and now the King 2 and King 3, but you had to report using the Global Reporting Initiative on what you were actually doing. And then you had an integrated sustainability report and an annual report, which then got merged into one. And that also kick-started a lot of spending on your corporate social responsibility and your environmental thing. And more importantly, you had measures in place and you can measure against them. Because some of the problem with CSR is, well, how do you know? I mean, you have 5 meetings with the community. Well, what's the outcome? How can you measure the outcome?
Well, you can.
Yeah.
How do you
There's
quantify success?
a lot of.
But yeah, if you can't measure it the way that the
Yeah.
senior board thinks, if you can't measure something, how can you tell whether or not you're successful? There are some companies out there
Yeah.
that take this and they run with it, and they do fantastic work. And one of them is De Beers. Then there are other companies that do less well, where it's tick, 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 tick. How do we stay in business? Yeah.
There are points to be learned out of that. So yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Jessica.
This is the really key point, I think, for what I took from your presentation. Relationship quality and social capital requires that both parties have capacity. The community needs to be strong in order to be a good business partner with the company.
Totally.
And to the extent that you can make investments in that community that is allowing it to become stronger and healthier and more, able to take care of itself, the better your project is going to be. And I think that's one thing that the SEAMPS, the Social and Environmental Effects Management Planning process, is revealing, and probably one reason why some of those projects are less controversial, because they're more explicitly being taken on board, and actually those companies are really going beyond compliance in taking on board some of the health effects and the social effects in a much more comprehensive way. Now, that isn't necessarily within the scope of a small company to be able to do, but I think it still reveals a fundamental lesson. That if you can be helping a community to develop baseline information on stuff that really matters to it, and wellness and health of the community is so important, that is, regardless of whether or not that's required in the regulatory process, you're building a good business partner and you're building your ability to have a good, strong, you called it social capital or relationship quality. So I think there's that may be an example that ties in these different threads of the presentation. I just wanted to share it in a more explicit way.
Yeah, no, it's very good, and it causes me to comment that clearly this is being seen as a joint planning process as well. Right? But yeah, I'm not suggesting any of this is simple or linear. It's not, but it's a discussion I think we need to keep having, because I do see us having, the last 15 years have been really pretty spectacular in many respects. But during this downturn, this is the time to have this discussion, because when the money comes back into the system, people aren't going to be paying attention. They're going to want to do it their way. But there are also going to be other players who are going to want it their way. So the risk is that we may go into another phase of episodic and on occasions quite uncomfortable conflicts. Trust is the elusive thing, but you don't necessarily have to have trust. What you need to have is some measure of respect and the ability to engage and dialogue on these processes. Trust somewhere out there. I mean, it takes time to do that, but that doesn't mean you can't start processes that have the capacity to take you to that level over time. I keep emphasizing it doesn't have to be a lot of money. Some of the most successful situations that I know about have not been particularly costly at all.
From my experience being in Canada, I just feel really impressed with how people do things here. I'm from Brazil. So I would say, wow, Canada is doing amazing, but I've been there in many mines working there, and there are like Canadian companies there, so I think like who really makes the decisions on the top? It has to do with money.
I don't
deny that.
Yeah, it has to do with money, but unfortunately, as soon as you start talking too eagerly about money, then people want, they keep falling back on the business case. And if there's a business case, I'll do it, and if there isn't a business case, I won't do it. But that's not good enough on the other side. That doesn't satisfy the communities, and it doesn't satisfy civil society.
Yeah, I'm not talking about.
And what I'm talking about is.
Communities, yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm talking about is the social contract that mining has with society at large, right?
Yeah.
Because there are aspects that are not seen as satisfactory at the moment. And it is largely in this area that we are generically calling the social sphere. I've honed in on just a few little pieces of that, but it's actually a bit bigger than that. But until you can satisfy the communities on a fairly consistent basis, and the civil society groups that support the communities and that monitor the industry, then there's going to be problems. Now, what's very interesting is that over the last little while, there hasn't been an awful lot of comment about the industry's environmental performance. There hasn't really been an awful lot. I mean, there's a great deal of concern raised at these tailing dam failures. That is absolutely the Achilles heel of the industry and has been for years, right? But on a broader level, out there in civil society, there's a lot of nodding heads and saying the mining industries, they're doing their job. They're trying hard. They're meeting expectations. And when we've done all these social license surveys, the environment doesn't figure on there. It's a given, right? If we have this level of legitimacy, credibility, trust, Okay, if your environmental performance is seen to be poor, you don't even meet legitimacy. You're not welcome, right? But clearly, by and large, the industry is performing above that level. So it doesn't turn up on these surveys. Didn't turn up on the Australian survey either, right? It only turns up when there's a failure, right? Or there's a failure to meet expected performance levels. But where the issues are outstanding, where you see an awful lot of this conflict, it revolves one way or another around some part of this social sphere. And that's the bit that seems to be hanging out there. And whilst the industry has done a very good job over the last 15 years since MMSD, right, there's been a general improvement overall. It hasn't been everywhere to the same level. There isn't parity out there. Ultimately, it doesn't seem to be meeting expectations. And that's a concern. I'd like to thank you for the conversation. We were allowed to be here until 6:30. It's time we did.